Alrighty, well, look, this is the last segment I wanted to be making on the YouTube channel. This is the last thing I wanted to be talking about the DCU because it's just gotten started. In all reality, the DCU has had 4 projects now with Creature Commando season 1, Superman the film, Peacemaker season 2, and then now Supergirl. It's just getting started, and it's only been a calendar year and maybe a couple months of change, but really between Superman and Supergirl, about a calendar year between those 2 projects. And let's not kid around. We talked about this last week. Supergirl is a huge disappointment at the box office. It is not doing well with critics, and it's doing okay with audiences, but it's generally not getting the response that DC wanted. But look, is that the death toll? Is that the bell ringing for DC to end this experiment with James Gunn and reboot again? And no, it's of course not. That in itself, having Superman be as successful as it was, making a good chunk of money based off of almost no goodwill for the DCU, coming off of the DCEU, and then doing as well as it did with critics and with audiences and making as much money as it did, is one subpar movie box office wise and critic wise going to sink the DCU after that? No, of course not, on its own. On its own. Because lo and behold, just under a couple weeks after the release of Supergirl, we got this bombshell of an article from The Hollywood Reporter. The Hollywood Reporter, by the way, which is not just a random YouTuber saying things. So if I were to go on YouTube and say all these things, do not listen to me. I mean, I may have my sources, but you should not trust me in that regard because I am not The Hollywood Reporter. I am not Variety. I am not The Wrap. I am not Deadline. I am not one of these incredibly reputable sources. The Hollywood Reporter, generally speaking, should be trusted. And The Hollywood Reporter dropped a bombshell of an article. I've read through it, and I want to read through at least a good portion of it, or at least skim through some of these things from top to bottom with you guys, because it is, I don't have any other words to describe it other than it is astounding. So the article is titled, Behind the Supergirl Bomb, Competing Cuts, Creative Differences. And what we're going to find here in this article as we go through it, again, I'm not going to read the entire thing. You can go check it out, Hollywood Reporter, it's all there. But we're going to read a good selection of it, and we're going to talk about my thoughts on it, because the last thing I expected when James Gunn took over from for DC from the DCEU was, sure, James Gunn might have his vision for what DC is going to look like. And sure, he might be strong about it. But he's made it clear. He's made it clear that he is going to let the artists do their work, let the writers do their work, and then he's going to oversee the story and he's going to direct and write certain projects. That's been his MO. That's what he said he was going to do. And so the kinds of creative differences that plagued the DCEU with what we're going to talk about, with competing cuts of movies, with massive studio interference, I should say, with a lack of vision and a lack of plan, which I don't think this article is really talking about here with James Gunn. There is a plan, it seems like, and that might be the problem. But the kinds of things that plagued the DCEU from the start, right as it got started with Suicide Squad, their second movie, is eerily similar to what's going on here. So again, it is just shocking to me that it is almost like history is repeating itself. Let's dive into this article here. So I'm going to just start from the beginning. We're not going to read everything, but I'm going to stop here and there and talk about my thoughts. So here we go. Buckle up. The article begins. Usually test scores go up, up, and away. But this March, the scores for Supergirl actually went down when DC Studios held a bake-off, testing competing cuts from filmmaker Craig Gillespie and from the studio run by James Gunn and Peter Safran. It was a moment of extreme disappointment for those involved, as the stakes were high, particularly for DC. Supergirl would be a key part for Warner Brothers, the Warner Brothers division, as its first feature not written and directed by Gunn following last year's inaugural outing, Superman. It needed to work to prove the studio could expand beyond projects directed by Gunn, the A-list filmmaker behind the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, Peacemaker, and the Suicide Squad, and the very public face of the brand. That is all true. This is me now interjecting this. That's all true. This movie was going to be the first non-James Gunn project out of the gate for DC, and it was going to be a test to whether James Gunn could function as a creative studio head and not a creative filmmaker. So that is definitely true. That is a big component as to what this movie meant. Moving on with the article. Months later, the Supergirl outcome is now well known. The movie, starring Millie Alcock as the title character and budgeted in the $170 to $180 million range, crashed and burned on its opening weekend, grossing just $31.7 million, even lower than the reviled DC-centric bomb 2024's Joker Folie à Deux, which opened to $37.6 million and was not made by Gunn and Safran. And I guess it bears repeating, but if you're ever compared in almost any light to Joker Folie à Deux, it's not good for you. And so the article continues. And while one failure need not be an indictment of a slate, that's what I said, right? That's what we talked about. A singular failure of a project is not going to derail a universe on its own in a vacuum. The article goes on to say, quote, and there have been all sorts of think pieces as to why the movie failed. Was Alcock right for the role of blah, blah, blah? They're going to talk about some of the reasons there, but the article goes on. The fate of Supergirl may have been sealed early on. Gunn and Gillespie, this is the article, Gunn and Gillespie had creative differences over the direction of the movie. Numerous sources tell The Hollywood Reporter, and the film never found its footing in the post-production process. The test scores, which are counted on a scale of out of 100 points, never escaped the 60s, according to multiple sources. Another insider said the movie's top score was 70. This is an insider's quote. They said, quote, they were not creatively aligned. Is the polite way of describing things, said one insider. Now, before we move on with this article here, because there's already a whole heap of things to talk about here, but before we move on here, it's important to note that we talked about here, the Hollywood Reporter's sources are generally very reliable. So I would believe that the Hollywood Reporter was told something to this light of the test scores were generally in the 60s and 70s. It's also worth pointing out, though, that test scores are generally very, very secretive. Right? It's not like test score leaks and rumors are happening all the time, because people who are in the test screenings are signing NDAs. They are under very, very tight security. So under any normal circumstance, when a leaker or scooper says, I know what happened at a test screening, I generally don't believe them, because it's just incredibly difficult to get any sort of concrete information out of a test screening or test score. At the same time, though, again, like I said, the Hollywood Reporter is pretty reliable, so who's to say? But it's just something I wanted to interject here. On with the article. Quote, other insiders dispute the characterization, saying Gunn, Safran, and Gillespie had the normal amount of healthy friction any filmmaker and studio have as part of the process of making a movie better. So there you go, right? There's other people saying that there wasn't maybe as much friction going on here as we might think from the beginning. Article goes on, quote, filming wrapped in May 2025, and as early as the fall of that year, the studio and Gillespie knew the movie wasn't working. After a December test screening proved to be just okay, the studio decided to take matters into its own hands and took charge of the post-production to make its own cut. The studio also enlisted writer Jeremy Slater, a Gunn favorite who previously wrote an unmade feature based on DC superhero team The Authority. I didn't know that, but there you go, to help with the post-production process. The extent of Slater's involvement is unclear, although it seems he helped write scenes for a 9-day shoot of additional photography. Original screenwriter Ana Nogueira remained involved in the post-production process as well. One issue at play was the climactic fight, which was reconfigured. So interestingly enough, despite whatever happened in the final product, we talked about Ana Nogueira in our review, and the fact that she is being given the reins to Wonder Woman after Supergirl and Teen Titans, and I have to say the writing was a bit lackluster in whatever the final cut of the film ended up being. She remained involved in the post-production process, so take that for what you will. We're going to read just a little bit more here because there's a lot here, but I want to read just until the point that they kind of resolve everything that went on here with the movie. So continuing on with the article, quote, other issues with the movie are unclear, but it is known that music was a key friction point. There is a lot of detail here. This is now me interjecting. There's a lot of detail here about the kinds of choices that were made. Apparently, James Gunn had a decision in writing or putting in a couple songs for the movie, and they kind of went back and forth on that. They tested a different song in the climactic fight, which was widely maligned. Not the choice that they made, rather, but the choice that they ended up going with, which was the cover of the song The Middle, was widely maligned, but who knows what happened here. It was apparently Girls Just Want to Have Fun was the song that was originally tested with James Gunn's version of the cut. So again, who knows, right? It's who knows if that would have tested any better than that. But this is what we're about to read. This is really where it all comes to a head. Quote, the movie employed 2 editors. There was Tatiana S. Regal, I apologize if I mispronounced that name, Gillespie's longtime post partner who edited his Lars and The Real Girl, I, Tanya, and Cruella. And there was Fred Raskin, Gunn's longtime cutter who worked on all the Guardians of the Galaxy movies and Gunn's DC series Peacemaker. Raskin is also Quentin Tarantino's go-to editor. He was brought on later in the process and provided key, etc., etc. So we're going to skip that for a little bit and go down to this paragraph. There were signs that things were getting better. Deep into winter, the test scores improved and hit the low 70s. However, rather than continue to tinker away on that cut, key here, this is really important, the studio decided to force a bake-off by creating two cuts, one by Gillespie and one by the studio. And when we say by the studio, we mean, and I'm not just extrapolating here, I'm not speculating here, this is what the article has been saying. By the studio, we mean Gunn and Fred Raskin. That is who we're talking about here. It is essentially James Gunn's creative vision against Craig Gillespie's. Okay, we're going to read, I think, one or two more paragraphs here. We're almost done. Quote, "It is unclear what major differences emerged, but one source says Gillespie's version was 11 minutes longer and featured more of the villain Krem. When the two competing versions tested, the scores surprisingly dropped significantly, although the studios inched out ahead of Gillespie's, but by only 2 points according to sources. Gillespie's version scored strongly on song choices, pacing, and villain, eking out a win, even a middling one. The studio chose its cut as the one to go into theaters. A studio insider says the differences were not particularly pronounced." And I think we're going to stop there. I think... we might read one more here. Quote, "Studios insiders point to the back and forth process as routine, but others, including one franchise filmmaker who spoke anonymously for this story but was not involved in Supergirl, held the opposite view. They say, quote, 'It happens more than you think, but it's not normal,' said the filmmaker." So we're going to stop right there. There is a lot more in this article. Honestly, we could make whole other segments about the fact that they are developing a Mr. Terrific series now, which was rumored before, but seems like it is being confirmed. We have other little bits of news here about, well, we're going to have Clayface and the Batman Part 2, that Jimmy Olsen Gorilla Grodd show is coming out as well. But honestly, I mean, we can stop right there because that is a lot to take in. And it is crazy because, guys, if you don't remember 2016, and a lot of this stuff didn't come out until later, so granted, it wasn't 2016 when this all happened, but 2016 really kicked off the DCEU. Because I know Man of Steel came out in 2013, but it was really 2016 with Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad that kicked off the shared DCEU. And Suicide Squad, the production behind that, things like competing cuts, a studio making a cut, or rather a separate company making a cut that was hired by the studio, which was, I think, a trailer company that made the cut of Suicide Squad that went into theaters, while David Ayer, the director of Suicide Squad, made his own version that was not seen, and now we have this whole Ayer cut thing going on here, where he says it's darker and it's more true to the original tone. I don't know if that's all true. I don't know if we're ever going to see it, but regardless, that's what he's saying. And Suicide Squad bombed. It was terrible. And yes, Suicide Squad on its own did not tank the DCEU, but it was a sign of the worrying things to come with the way that the studio was treating the filmmakers. Look, I am not here to say anything. I'm not here to speculate on the fact that the James Gunn DCU is going to be a disaster for every project that he doesn't direct or produce, because I don't know. I think Lanterns looks awesome, and I hope Lanterns is awesome. I think Clayface, as somebody who doesn't like horror, looks really good. I hope those projects are amazing. But this is alarmingly similar to what happened to the DCEU, and that concerns me so much, because if it was just the fact that Supergirl was not that good, and it was just the fact that it didn't make a lot of money, then fine, you move on, because the positives you can take out of Supergirl are not things that will derail you moving forward, or rather the negatives that you take out from Supergirl. And the positives are things you can carry moving forward. The positives being Millie Alcock as Supergirl. You can take her and still put her in your future films, because she was great, and I think she was generally really well liked by a lot of people from the film who watched the film. But this is something different, and I don't know. I know that studio interference, quote-unquote studio interference, is very common for these big comic book movie franchises. I know that Kevin Feige does it. Look, I'm not naive, and I'm not saying that this is a unique problem to DC, but this whole competing cuts and competing versions of the movie and all this stuff that's going on is so eerily reminiscent of what happened to the DCEU and Suicide Squad that this, above anything else, above Supergirl's poor box office, above the fact that I didn't like Supergirl, above the fact that the critics were kind of middling on Supergirl. This concerns me so incredibly much for the DCU moving forward. I don't know where we go from here. I truly don't. Because now that this is out there, we're going to look at every DC project through this lens of, okay, is it good? If it's good, then great. That if it's not good, then we're gonna have to ask the question: what happened to it? Was it James Gunn? Did they meddle with it, quote unquote meddle with it? And that is so disappointing because I want the DCU. I hope we all want the DCU to succeed and just flourish. But this is just the exact opposite thing that we wanted to hear right out of the gates for the DCU. So I don't know what to make of this, frankly. And I'm not saying that James Gunn is a meddler. I'm not saying that James Gunn is going to ruin the DCU or rather ruin the projects that he doesn't make. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen here with regards to Superman or Supergirl rather. But this is, like I said, the last thing I ever wanted to hear. So we'll see what happens moving forward. But yeah, this is all crazy. I would encourage you. I know we read actually a decent chunk of that article here because I think it's important that I tell you guys what this article is saying and I don't paraphrase and I don't make up things because this is just a wild thing that I was reading over the weekend and we just had to talk about it. So we'll see what happens with the DCU moving forward. Guys, what do you make of all of this that happened behind the scenes of Supergirl? What do you think it says about the DCU moving forward and James Gunn? Let me know in the comments down below.